Welcome to the night. A white signal rose and an entire fortress vanished before anyone knew what it meant. April 12, 1864. Fort Pillow, Tennessee. The ridge above the Mississippi breathing smoke and rain. The men inside the earth and timber walls had fought since dawn. They were 600 Union soldiers, half of them newly freed men wearing blue for the first time. Across the hollow waited General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry veterans hardened by 2 years of war, and no one on either side understood that a single flag, a single flash of white, was about to rewrite the story of the river itself. The reports call it a flag of truce. Others swear it was a flare, a burst of light through the haze too bright too early. What it truly signaled, no one agreed on. The Union garrison believed it meant negotiation. Forrest's men thought it meant defiance. The hill went silent for a heartbeat, then thunder cracked and the silence broke apart forever. Private William F. Stewart, one of the few who lived to write, remembered seeing a white thing waving, then the whole fort turned red. He said he felt the air pull out of his lungs, the kind of pressure that comes before a storm, and then the world roared. Cannonballs tore through parapets built of cotton bales. Horses screamed. The bluff shook so hard that men tumbled into the riverbank trenches they had dug the night before. Somewhere someone shouted, "Cease fire," but the echo came back as fire orders bent in the wind, words twisted by distance and panic. No one was sure who had spoken first. Down on the water gunboat, Olive Branch heard the explosions and sent up a signal of its own 2 red rockets to warn Memphis. For the men at the fort, the sky had already become a battlefield of light. Smoke folded over the ramparts, hiding friend and foe alike. Stewart wrote that he fired until his rifle burned his hands, then realized he was shooting at silhouettes that might have been his own comrades. We could see nothing, he said, only the flash and the fire above the river. By mid-afternoon, the slope was chaos. Forrest's cavalry surged forward under the bluff. The Union line bent inward, compressing until the fort itself became a trap. Officers tried to raise the white flag again, a shirt tied to a ramrod, but the dust and glare made everything look like fire. One eyewitness later swore the flag was shot down by mistake. Another said it was never seen at all. Between those contradictions lies the heart of the story. A signal meant to stop the killing became the moment no one could stop it. When the sun dropped, the sound changed. The cannon fell silent. Only the river kept moving. Flames from the shattered gun platforms slid into the current, spreading across the black water like veins of molten glass. To men watching from the opposite shore, it looked as if the Mississippi itself had caught the light and refused to let go. Newspapers later wrote that the river burned until morning. Scientists will tell you it was oil and pitch tar from the fort's torches, but in the towns downstream they said otherwise. They said the river carried the sin. Before we go further, leave a comment where you're watching from, and the exact moment you felt the air change. Because this isn't just history, it's a signal that still travels. Every time someone misreads the meaning of a white flag, the light from Fort Pillow flickers again. Imagine the smell, gunpowder damp clay, and the sweet rot of spring magnolia crushed under boots. Imagine the sky turning a metallic gray that made every reflection look like steel. Then imagine realizing the battle has ended, and no one knows which side won. The Confederates held the ground by dusk, yet the victory read like a warning. Forrest's own report said the river ran red for 200 yards. Washington called for an inquiry. The survivors called it betrayal. The place itself said nothing. Only the Mississippi kept its rhythm slow, relentless, carrying fragments of wood uniforms and stories that no one wanted to claim. In the years that followed, travelers swore that on still nights, they saw a pale shimmer above that bend of the river, not flame, not fog, something in between. They called it the burning water. Old steamboat pilots tipped their hats when they passed, just in case the dead were listening. The legend grew that the flare had fallen into the river and was still burning somewhere beneath, trapped in the current, a light that never reached its destination. That is where our story begins, with a signal no one meant to send, a misunderstanding too bright to forget, and a river that refuses to go dark. The rest, the orders, the reports, the silence that followed will come later. For now, remember the image, a single white flash above Fort Pillow, and the water below answering with fire. Before the light broke, the fort was already awake. Boots scraped against wet clay ramrods, clinked, voices murmured in the fog. April 12, 1864. Fort Pillow, Tennessee, a lonely bluff on the Mississippi, 40 miles above Memphis. The river moved slow and brown beneath the walls, carrying driftwood and the smell of pine tar from the gunboat moored below. Inside the parapet stood 600 Union soldiers, roughly half of them black men of the U.S. colored troops, recently freed, fighting in the same uniform that had once been forbidden to them. They were commanded by Major Lionel F. Booth, a quiet officer from Ohio who believed the fort could hold. Across the ridges hidden by cedar and mist rode General Nathan Bedford Forrest and 1,500 Confederate cavalry veterans of a dozen raids, their gray jackets dark with rain. They had marched through the night, encircling the bluff like a tightening noose. Forrest's orders were simple: cut the Union's riverline, seize supplies, and send a message that the Mississippi was still Confederate ground. He had captured posts all week, Henning, Brownsville, Union City, each falling faster than the one before. Now Fort Pillow stood as the last obstacle between his horsemen and Memphis. At dawn, he formed his men along the tree line and signaled the buglers. Their notes, high, metallic, echoing off water, rolled across the fog like the cry of a bird no one had ever heard before. From the parapet, Union pickets answered with a single cannon shot that vanished into the mist. The war had found them again. Major Booth walked the rampart, checking batteries. The fort was an uneven horseshoe of earth and cotton bales, its outer wall already eroded by spring rain. He had about 6 field guns short of ammunition, and a mixed garrison, white Tennessee loyalists, a handful of artillerymen from Illinois, and the newly enlisted black soldiers of the 13th U.S. SAS-colored artillery light. Some wore ill-fitting coats, some still carried muskets older than they were. Yet morale in the letters found later was steady. "Better to die free than live a slave," one corporal wrote the night before. In the logbook, Booth noted the date, the weather, foggy, warm, river falling, and the rumor that Forrest was coming. He closed the book at 6 a.m. and stepped outside. Moments later, the first Confederate shell struck the northwest bastion. The hill exploded with sound. Gunfire echoed between river and ravine until direction meant nothing. Forrest's men advanced by companies, slipping through gullies, invisible from above, firing and falling back, testing the range. By 8 o'clock, the Union flag still flew, but the walls were crumbling. Booth ordered his gunners to concentrate on the eastern slope. When he turned to shout another command, a sharpshooter's bullet caught him just below the eye. He died before anyone reached him. Command passed to Major William F. Bradford Young, impulsive, determined to hold at any cost. His first act was to pull the men inward, shortening the line. His second, to signal the gunboat on the river for support. No help came. The olive branch lay grounded on a sandbar, too far to fire, without hitting friend and foe alike. By mid-morning, the fort was a furnace. Sunlight pierced the fog in thin white spears glinting off bayonets and the brass rings of artillery harness. Cannon smoke drifted through magnolia leaves. The black troops at the lower rifle pits fought hand-to-hand, loading and firing so fast, their barrels turned blue. Confederate officers later admitted respect for their discipline, then added with bitterness that seeing them in blue uniforms inflamed our men beyond control. The racial fury boiling beneath the surface of the war had reached its edge here on this bluff above the river. Every shot carried more than tactics. It carried years of vengeance and fear. At 9 o'clock, Forrest sent a rider under a white flag. The note demanded immediate and unconditional surrender. Bradford refused. Witnesses on both sides described the pause that followed, silence, heavy enough to hear the river lapping below, the caw of crows above the smoke. Then Forrest signaled again, ordering an artillery barrage to quicken their decision. When the shells landed, dust and cotton filled the air like snow. Men coughed, blinded, thinking the attack had resumed in earnest. It hadn't yet. That misunderstanding became the seed of the catastrophe that history would later argue over. Inside the fort, soldiers debated whether to hold or flee to the gunboat. Some argued they could run the slope, reach the water, and swim for it. Others feared being shot in the open. Bradford chose to fight. He believed reinforcements were moving up from Memphis. He was wrong. Forrest had cut every road. By noon, Confederate sharpshooters had reached the outer ditches. The defenders were firing downward into men almost beneath their boots. The heat, the smoke, the screams of horses and men created a rhythm without pause, a heartbeat of battle that drowned out thought. No one noticed that the flag of truce still hung on Forrest's line, a small square of white waving faintly through the haze. Somewhere along the parapet, a private shouted that the Confederates were advancing under that flag. Another insisted they were withdrawing. Bradford raised his field-glass saw movement and ordered a volley. The volley drew an answer, hundreds of rifles at once. The two sides collided again, the flag forgotten. Later investigations would struggle to determine whether the confusion began there. What is certain is that between noon and 3 communication collapsed. Messages sent to the gunboat never arrived. Orders within the fort contradicted one another. And still through it all the river kept flowing unbothered, carrying the echo of gunfire down toward Memphis. When Forrest prepared his final assault around 3 p.m., his men had the higher ground. He rode forward to within shouting distance of the fort and demanded surrender once more. Accounts differ. Some say Bradford agreed, others that he hesitated. Forrest later wrote, "I sent my flag twice, both times it was abused." Union survivors insisted they were in the act of surrendering when the Confederates charged. What none of them deny is the flash of white seen above the rampart just before the last attack. A shirt, a flag, a flare, a misunderstanding that would become legend. It rose, once wavered, and disappeared in smoke. Then the hillside moved gray against blue, and the fort vanished beneath the charge. By nightfall, only the river knew what had happened. The air hung thick with ash. Some bodies smoldered where torches had fallen. The Mississippi reflected the flames like a mirror, long streaks of orange sliding south into darkness. From the opposite shore, farmers saw the glow and thought the forest was on fire. They would tell that story for years, long after the reports in Washington tried to turn it into numbers. But the truth was simpler: a small bluff, a flag, misread a battle that should have ended hours earlier and didn't. The men who survived said the sound never left their ears, the echo of that last white signal fading into the roar of the river. That was Fort Pillow before history named it, a massacre before politics decided who was right and who was wrong. It was a place built to guard a river, and instead became part of it, a strip of earth dissolved by spring rain and human fury. By morning, the flagpole still stood blackened and bent, pointing toward water that looked almost silver under the first light. And somewhere beneath that surface, the current carried what remained of the misunderstanding that started it all. The official story begins in handwriting, faded ink, uneven lines, filed by officers who survived that day on the bluff. At about 3 o'clock, one report reads, "A flag of truce was observed upon the enemy's line." That single sentence, copied into the report of the Committee on the Conduct of the War, would become the most disputed line of the entire campaign. What followed was neither order nor chaos alone, it was both in the same breath. Major Bradford, now commanding Fort Pillow, believed he had accepted Forrest's terms to discuss surrender. Forrest, reading the same gestures, believed the discussion rejected. Between them stretched a slope of smoke and misunderstanding. Witnesses later recalled a white cloth rising from the parapet, just as Confederate bugles sounded advance. Whether the flag came too late or the bugles too soon, no two statements ever matched. One captain wrote, "It was impossible to tell signal from sunlight." At 3:15 p.m., the assault began. The Confederate lines surged from the trees, shouting, their boots sliding in the clay. The Union defenders, expecting a truce, hesitated, then fired, then stopped, then fired again. The sound turned ragged like thunder breaking into echo. The lower rifle pits fell first. Survivors scrambled up toward the inner walls, stumbling through smoke that smelled of saltpeter and damp cotton. Within minutes, the blue line folded. Forrest's report described it coldly. The enemy's flag was still flying, the position carried by storm. In Bradford's version, recorded later at Cairo, Illinois, the flag was struck before the rush. The truth lay somewhere in the wind that carried their words away. After the brief silence came confusion, impossible to map. Confederate troopers poured into the fort. Union soldiers fled toward the bluff, hands raised, some into the river itself. From the gunboat, Olive Branch downstream, observers saw the flash of rifles on the ridge and signaled ceasefire, but distance made the message meaningless. Smoke erased language. When night fell, Fort Pillow no longer existed as a command post, only as terrain. The following morning, April 13th, Forrest's headquarters sent a dispatch. The river ran red for 200 yards. I have taken about 100 prisoners. In Washington, that sentence stunned the War Department. Telegraph operators copied it 3 times to confirm. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered an immediate investigation. Newspapers in the North called it a massacre. Southern papers printed Forrest's rebuttal. The fort's garrison refused quarter until the very last. Between those headlines, a new kind of battle began, the war over what words could mean. Witness testimony collected that summer revealed patterns too consistent to ignore. Private George Brown of the 13th U.S. Colored Artillery stated, "We were ordered to lay down arms. I did so." The firing continued. Sergeant Daniel Stamps testified, "I saw the white flag. I saw men fall after." Confederate Captain Anderson Fluellen told a different story. No order was given to kill. The men were excited. Some shots may have been fired without command. The committee wrote in its conclusion, "The testimony shows beyond doubt that the killing continued after resistance had ceased." Forrest, when questioned, replied only, "War is war, gentlemen." The Fort Pillow investigation stretched for months. Reporters camped along the Mississippi, sketching the burned remains of the fort, half buried, half washed away. Army engineers described charred timbers, fragments of shells, human remains interred hastily under shallow clay. They also noted something no one could explain, a black residue floating on the river surface, drifting downstream for days. Locals said it looked like oil slicks catching the sun, glowing at dusk. Scientists blamed tar from the fort's magazines. Preachers in Memphis called it judgment. The soldiers who had been there said nothing at all. Back in Tennessee, Forrest defended his conduct in a letter to General Stephen D. Lee. The reports of inhumanity are grossly exaggerated. The river's color was natural. The imagination of our enemies has supplied the rest. Yet his own adjutant, Captain Anderson, wrote privately that the excitement was such that discipline was impossible. Those 2 sentences, denial and admission, sit side by side in the archives today, neither erasing the other. In August 1864, Congress published the Joint Committee Report on Fort Pillow. Its language was restrained but devastating. The facts cannot be denied. The massacre was not the result of accident or misapprehension. It was the embodiment of that policy which declares that black soldiers shall not be recognized as legitimate combatants. The document filled 30 pages. Forrest was never charged. The war moved on. Fort Pillow remained a name spoken in a lower voice, like a wound that never closed. For the men who survived, memory became the only map left. Some returned to service. Others vanished into hospital rosters marked debility. One letter, found years later in a trunk at Helena, Arkansas, carried the line, "Every time I see a white flag now, I think of fire." Another, written by a Confederate scout, confessed, "When I cross the river, I still see it shine, though there's no light there." These are small sentences, but they hold more of the truth than any official record. By the end of 1864, the fort itself had dissolved. Spring floods carried its earthworks into the Mississippi. Only the bluff remained carved by rain. Steamboat pilots marked the spot on their charts as Pillow Bend. Passengers who traveled that route after dark often noticed a shimmer on the water, faint and wavering, just where the old flagpole had stood. The Army engineers noted it too, a phenomenon of phosphorescent bacteria, they said, but even they wrote the words, "appears like flame." Washington's archives preserve one final memorandum, dated November 4th, 1864. The events at Fort Pillow are of such a character as to demand remembrance. The sentence feels bureaucratic, yet it carries the entire weight of what history cannot resolve. The reports close there. The river does not. Standing on that bluff today, you hear little but wind through cane and the distant hum of barges. No walls, no flags, no trace of the misunderstanding that turned signal into catastrophe. But if you listen carefully at dusk, the air still holds 2 sounds layered together, the whistle of a steamboat, and something older, a low note rising from the water like breath. Scientists will tell you it's just the river shifting over buried timber. Historians will call it resonance. The locals have another word, memory. That memory is the truest fact left. Every document, every sworn statement, every denial leads back to the same place, a moment when communication failed and humanity followed. The night the signal went wrong did not end with the battle. It continued in the pages of inquiry, in arguments of generals, in the silence of survivors, and in the long glow that the Mississippi still throws against the sky when storms move east. Official history closed its file. The river kept burning. The river remembers differently. In official records, it is measured in miles and tonnage, but in the voices of those who live along it, it is a listener, a witness, a judge. After the war, when steamboats once again traced the Mississippi from Cairo to Vicksburg, pilots told newcomers that one bend near Henning should be passed in silence. They called it Pillow Bend. No horn, no song, no laughter. The river don't like noise there, they said. And they never said why, though everyone already knew. Stories grew from that silence. Farmers along the bank spoke of mornings when the water looked copper under a cloudless sky, as if it remembered the reflection of flame. Children fishing near the landing were told to be polite, to speak soft to the water. In the river towns, old soldiers from both sides met in saloons, trading rumors that a light still flickered there on humid nights. Not ghost light, just a shimmer that came and went. They called it the lantern that never reached shore. Newspapers of the 1880s loved such things. The Memphis Appeal ran a column titled Legends of the Great River. One issue printed a letter from a steamboat engineer claiming he had seen a sheet of fire run along the surface for nearly a minute while rounding Pillow Bend. Editors explained it as natural gas igniting from the mudflats. The next week, the paper received a dozen more letters, each saying the same. It looked like the flare of '64. The legend fed itself, each generation retelling it, until fact and memory fused like sediment under current. By then, Fort Pillow had vanished. Floods reclaimed the bluff. The Army's outline maps marked it only as site of former works. Cotton plantations covered the high ground. Yet every few years, the earth would give something back, a buckle, a rusted musket, a brass button stamped. U.S. children found them while plowing and brought them to elders who shook their heads and said, "Don't keep it. The river wants its own." Some threw the relics back into the water. Others nailed them above doors for protection. That too became custom, a quiet covenant between memory and survival. Local preachers folded the story into sermons. The river burned because men mistook the sign one said in 1902, standing in a church built of logs not far from the old fort. They saw white and thought it meant victory, not mercy. Congregations nodded, understanding. More than history, they understood warning. The tale of the signal became parable. Do not answer every light with violence. Some are meant to save you. It entered hymn and proverb. Even school teachers decades later used it when teaching the cost of miscommunication. The signal went wrong, they told students, because no one listened long enough to be sure. When veterans of the U.S. colored troops returned to visit in the 1880s, reporters followed them. They found a group of old men standing at the river's edge, staring at the current. One, identified as Private David Hunt, was quoted in the Chicago Tribune. "We left something in that water, not hate, not blood, but sound. Listen, you can hear it hum." The journalist wrote that indeed the air seemed to carry a low vibration from the water, as if the current itself were a distant drum. Scientific explanations came later, Eddy's barge propellers, shifting sandbars, but the phrasing stayed. The hum of the river became another way to say the past still speaking. By the turn of the century, Pillow Bend belonged to the storytellers. Some said the river glowed because of minerals in the soil. Others said it glowed because it refused to forget. When electric lights came to the towns, people noticed that bulbs along the riverfront flickered more than elsewhere. Old-timers joked, "That's Fort Pillow borrowing the current." Even in jest, the link held. Memory had found a new medium, electricity replacing flame, but the story identical. A signal sent, misunderstood, repeated forever. During the First World War, bargemen carried the legend overseas. Letters from American soldiers in France mentioned the river that burned, comparing it to the battlefields they now crossed. One Tennessean wrote home, they say, "The sky at Verdun glows like the Mississippi did that night. Maybe it's all one mistake still traveling the world." His words were printed in local papers, and once more the myth of the signal lived, reshaped, now warning of global confusion, instead of a single battle. Folklore had outgrown geography. Historians came later with notebooks and tape recorders. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project sent interviewers through the Delta asking elders what they remembered. An old woman named Eliza Green living near Covington told them, "My papa said the river burned the truth into itself so nobody could lie about it." When the interviewer asked if she believed it literally burned, she laughed softly. "No, child. The water don't burn. The memory does." That single sentence, "the water doesn't burn, the memory does," became the closing line of several WPA transcripts. It still echoes in academic papers written a century later. By mid-century, the story shifted again. Civil rights workers traveling through West Tennessee invoked Fort Pillow as a symbol, a warning that misunderstanding between power and justice could ignite the world. Folk singers wrote ballads using the refrain, "The signal went wrong, the river still shines." Their verses replaced soldiers with every kind of human misreading. Lovers, governments, neighbors, each seeing what they wanted in the light. The myth had become metaphor. And yet on quiet nights, river pilots swore they still saw a gleam on the bend, a tiny reflection no map could explain. Science would later offer one last explanation. In 1964, a study from the University of Memphis attributed the glow to bioluminescent bacteria stirred by the current against iron deposits. The report concluded, perceived as flame when viewed at distance. It might have closed the case, but the locals were unimpressed. They said the scientists had measured the wrong thing. They'd studied the light, not the silence around it. Because that's what remained more than any visible glow, the silence. Boats still lower their horns there. Anglers still speak softly. Each spring when the river floods, it rewrites its banks, erasing footprints, swallowing fences, depositing new layers of silt. Yet somehow that one curve always looks the same. The bluff still leans toward the water as if listening. And every person who stops there feels it, the weight of a message once misread, still traveling downstream, still seeking an answer. The legend of Fort Pillow isn't about ghosts or punishment. It's about translation, how a signal can change meaning between sender and receiver, between generation and generation, between nation and memory. The river is just the messenger. It burns only because we keep lighting it with our recollection. So when people say the Mississippi glows at Pillow Bend, what they mean is simpler history never learned how to sleep. History does not end at a riverbank. It bends, carries its meaning downstream, and resurfaces wherever people misread one another again. Fort Pillow was not the last wrong signal. It was only the first we wrote down. Since that April day in 1864, the world has raised countless flares, flags, and transmissions that meant one thing to the sender and another to the receiver. And every time the cost was measured in silence. A generation later, new signals filled the air. In 1914, the governments of Europe sent telegrams written in cautious language, half coded, half pleading. One message from Vienna was delayed by hours. Another from Berlin was interpreted as mobilization rather than negotiation. The result was the First World War, millions answering a signal that no one intended to send. Historians still debate the July crisis, but all agree on one phrase: miscommunication born of pride. The flare had changed shape from torchlight over the Mississippi to ink and wires across a continent, but it carried the same misunderstanding, the same motif repeated in 1941. At Pearl Harbor, radar operators detected incoming aircraft at 7:02 a.m. The signal was real, but the interpretation wrong. The duty officer assumed the blips were American B-17s arriving from the mainland. 38 minutes later, the sky turned black with enemy planes. The error was not ignorance. It was familiarity. They had seen the pattern before and believed they knew it. In that moment, the same logic that doomed Fort Pillow reappeared: confidence mistaken for comprehension. In April 1986, deep in the night at Chernobyl, engineers read their instruments as stable. Alarms blinked. One man silenced them, convinced the sensors were malfunctioning. The result was an explosion that carried radiation across Europe. Later investigators wrote the signal was clear. The belief was stronger. Again, humanity read light as safety, not warning. The pattern crosses every frontier. During the Vietnam War in August 1964, radar operators aboard the USS Maddox reported torpedo attacks that never happened. In Washington, analysts misread those signals as proof of aggression. Within days, Congress authorized open conflict. When historians reviewed the logs decades later, they found confusion radar echoes mistaken for enemy fire, lightning storms mistaken for weapons. One official admitted we were fighting ghosts on a screen. The line could have come from Fort Pillow. Even peace has its wrong signals. In 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov sat in a bunker outside Moscow when computers reported 5 incoming U.S. missiles. Protocol required immediate retaliation. Petrov hesitated. The numbers felt wrong. He trusted his instinct over the machine, and the signal proved false. His refusal may have prevented nuclear war. For once, someone paused before answering the flare. All these moments, the telegrams of 1914, the radar blips of 1941, the false echoes of 1964, the blinking lights of 1983 form a single line of continuity. Technology changes. The human weakness does not. At Fort Pillow, men misread surrender for defiance. In every century since, nations have misread data for truth. The medium modernized. The misunderstanding stayed ancient. The Mississippi, meanwhile, kept flowing. When the congressional investigators reached the ruins in 1864, they described a silence more accusing than speech. That phrase could describe the archives of any later disaster boxes of transcripts, logs, and reports, trying to decode a moment already lost. Each inquiry ends the same way: misinterpretation, faulty communication, procedural failure. Polite terms for what history refuses to name directly: our inability to listen. Every wrong signal begins with noise, the hum before the message. In 1864, it was cannon fire and the wind off the river. In 1914, it was the tapping of telegraph keys. In 1941, it was the radar tone. In 1986, it was the steady buzz of a control room. The sounds differ, but each hum carries the same rhythm: certainty growing louder than truth. That is the real flame that never went out. Modern historians of communication trace the Fort Pillow misunderstanding as an early military example of signal failure under stress. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Dana, who visited the site 3 days after, wrote, "When the line between command and comprehension collapses, war reverts to instinct." His words echo eerily in modern analyses of friendly fire incidents and mislaunched weapons systems. The vocabulary has changed: data corruption, false positive target misidentification. But the meaning remains identical to what Bradford faced on that bluff: a message that no longer means what it meant. Today, satellites orbit the Earth, sending billions of signals per second, messages of love, orders of war, instructions for machines. They all travel at the speed of light, faster than reflection. Yet the core question lingers, older than electricity. What if we still don't understand one another? What if every screen we hold is another Fort Pillow waiting to happen? A white flare rising, meant for surrender, read as attack. Scholars studying the memory of Fort Pillow often quote a single line from the congressional report. The signal went up in daylight, but the night it caused has not ended. That sentence has been cited in research on communication theory, ethics, and even artificial intelligence, each field finding itself in the same metaphor. When machines misread humans, when humans misread machines, when words lose their shape between sender and receiver, we stand again on that bluff above the river, waiting for meaning to arrive. The bridge between history and now is not built of technology, but of perception. At Fort Pillow, misperception killed men. Today, it fractures nations. Yet the river, any river, offers another lesson. It listens longer than we do. It carries the error forward until someone downstream learns to read it correctly. The hope, thin but real, is that understanding might travel the same path. So this is where the story widens. The flare above the Mississippi becomes a symbol not of battle, but of translation, the human struggle to interpret light and language before it's too late. It ties Fort Pillow to every place where meaning and message diverge, to the telegram that sparked a world war, to the radar echo that fooled an empire, to the digital alerts we scroll through daily without question. The motif is clear. Now history itself is a series of wrong signals trying to correct their course. The file labeled Fort Pillow in the National Archives ends with one last annotation written in pencil by an unknown clerk. See also other instances of error. No list follows because the list never ends. It reaches into every century that came after. And as long as people keep mistaking light for order and silence for peace, the river will keep its lesson ready. A reminder written in current, we are still learning how to listen. There is a point in every archive where the handwriting trembles. The reports of Fort Pillow reach that point around page 40. Ink thins, sentences shorten. The clerks who copied testimonies in Washington in the summer of 1864 began to leave margins blank, as if the paper itself hesitated. The investigation had gathered hundreds of statements, but none could name who raised the white flag or who fired after it fell. The signal remains unaccounted for. The summary reads, "That sentence became the hinge of history, the single unsolved motion on which everything turns." For months after the battle, investigators rode the riverbanks collecting fragments. They found shell casings melted together, gun parts rusted into shapes like twisted branches, the brass eagle from a kepi cap fused to a piece of iron. Each object was labeled boxed and shipped north. The Mississippi kept erasing their footprints behind them, reclaiming every clue. One officer wrote, "The river seems determined to withhold the rest of the evidence." He was right. Every storm that spring carved away more of the bluff until the site itself became testimony, a wound without an edge. In Washington, witnesses arrived by train and waited in long corridors smelling of ink and sweat. Union survivors in faded uniforms sat beside civilians from Tennessee who had seen the smoke from miles away. Their accounts conflicted on detail, but agreed on one feeling: confusion so complete it felt designed. Sergeant Daniel Stamps repeated that the flare was white. Captain Anderson insisted it was red. A riverboat pilot swore it was no flare at all, but a piece of burning cotton blown from the walls. Each man saw what he needed to see, wrote journalist Benjamin H. Smith, whose notes later shaped the congressional report. Truth became color, and color depended on the uniform. When General Forrest himself appeared before the committee, the room fell silent. He was tall, austere, his gray uniform spotless. Asked whether he ordered the assault under a flag of truce, he answered, "My men acted under fire." The confusion was mutual. Pressed further, he said the phrase that would outlive him: "War means fight." No witness contradicted him aloud. They did not need to. The silence that followed was its own verdict. Outside, crowds gathered on Pennsylvania Avenue, holding newspapers that screamed "Fort Pillow Massacre." In the South, papers answered with northern lies. Between the headlines lay the chasm the river had already carved. Each side wrote its own version, each printed certainty over uncertainty. The flare had become a metaphor for truth itself, seen misread and gone. In August 1864, the Joint Committee published its final report. 31 pages of testimony, one paragraph of conclusion. The facts cannot be denied. Yet what those facts meant was left unwritten. The printed text ends abruptly, followed by 3 blank leaves space that archivists later used for notes. On the first of those blank pages, someone in pencil scrawled, "Who gave the signal? No one ever answered." That question is still there, pressed between glass in the National Archives, the graphite faint but legible, the question mark shaped like a hook. Years passed. Forrest resigned his command, later entering business, then politics, defending his actions to the end. Bradford disappeared after being paroled. Rumor said he was murdered on the road home. The soldiers of the U.S. colored troops who survived returned to service elsewhere, carrying scars no uniform could cover. In their letters, they avoided describing the battle directly. Instead, they used metaphors: firelight signal. "I dream of a flare that never lands," one wrote from Louisiana in 1865. Another, "We had no words for surrender that day, only the smoke." The investigation could not measure such sentences, so it filed them away under miscellaneous correspondence. Decades later, when historians reopened the boxes, the paper had turned sepia. Reading them, one feels the heat still trapped between pages. The accounts differ on weapons and timing, but all share a moment of suspended perception, a human pause between command and comprehension. That pause is the true climax of the story, the instant when language fails and instinct decides. It is the space between the raising of a hand and the pulling of a trigger, between message sent and meaning received. Every war contains it. Fort Pillow merely exposed it. By the 20th century, that silence had become symbol. Military academies studied Fort Pillow under the heading Breakdown of Command Communication. Psychologists cited it as an early example of collective cognitive overload. The term changes, the lesson remains. Under pressure, humans revert to assumption. Under noise, they stop hearing. And in that gap, violence grows like static. But the story's highest tension lies not in the battle, nor in the inquiry, but in the moment. The narrative turns on itself when the search for fact begins to mirror the very confusion it investigates. Reporters argued about sources, senators accused one another of bias, and every attempt to define truth produced more noise. It was as if the original signal had multiplied, echoing through decades of interpretation. The river had found its new form in paper and ink. In 1894, the fort site was briefly excavated before floods closed the project. Workers unearthed fragments of the old flagpole and pieces of iron still blackened by fire. Among them lay a corroded flare case stamped U.S. Whether it had been fired that day or simply stored there, no one could prove. Newspapers called it the signal shell. It toured museums for years before vanishing during a warehouse flood. Photographs survive a small metal tube, hollow, innocent-looking, and captions that argue whether it was the cause or the witness. That object or its idea is the physical climax, the artifact that collapses certainty into myth. The emotional climax, though, belongs to the survivors' reunion in 1904. They met at a cemetery near Memphis under a gray sky. The oldest, nearly blind, stood before a monument carved with their regiment's name. When asked if justice had ever been served, he said quietly, "The river decided." Reporters recorded the line, unsure what he meant. Perhaps he meant that time had eroded guilt, as surely as the Mississippi eroded soil. Or perhaps he meant that the river's endless motion was judgment enough, a reminder that nothing truly still survives. From that day forward, every retelling of Fort Pillow carried two endings, the official one printed in ledgers and the silent one carried by current. In one, men seek answers. In the other, the river keeps its own counsel. The clash between them is the tension that sustains the story a century later. It is why historians return again and again, turning pages already known by heart, waiting for a different outcome that never arrives. In modern documentaries, the camera often returns to the river at dusk, a long shot, unmoving. The surface shifting between bronze and black. That image is the visual climax, not fire, not violence, but reflection. The viewer sees the same light the soldiers once saw, and the same question rises, what does it mean? There are no explosions now, only the low hum of water against stone. Yet within that sound lies the same paradox, how something so constant can hold so much unrest. The true climax of Fort Pillow, then, is not discovery, but realization that history's greatest mystery is not who gave the signal, but why we keep needing to repeat it. Every generation finds its own version, a command misheard, a message misread, a truth mistranslated, and each time believes it will be the last. The flare still rises, though we call it by different names. Telegram, siren, headline, alert. The river still answers with reflection, patient and relentless, reminding us that meaning cannot travel faster than understanding. And somewhere in the archives under glass, that pencil note waits. Who gave the signal? Its graphite faded to the color of smoke. The question outlived every witness, every reporter, every historian who tried to close the file. It has become the pulse beneath the story, the heartbeat of history itself. Perhaps the river already knows the answer. Perhaps it has been whispering it all along in a language we still cannot translate. The river is quiet now. No cannons, no bugles, no flare to split the sky, only the slow breath of water folding around the bend. Yet every ripple carries the echo of that afternoon in 1864, when one signal rose and meaning fell. The battlefield is gone, swallowed by mud and cotton fields. But the question remains, how can a single gesture, a white flag, a misunderstood light, shape a century of memory? Standing on the bluff today, you see barges drift past where the fort once stood. Pilots lower their horns out of habit. Tourists pass the marker that reads Fort Pillow Site, April 12, 1864, and keep walking. The earth gives no clue of what happened, but the silence feels deliberate, as if the ground has learned discretion better than men ever did. Historians still search the archives for a missing order, a diary, a name to close the loop. None has found it. Perhaps the loop is not meant to close. Because the story of Fort Pillow isn't about endings. It's about echoes. Every time nations misread a warning, every time anger drowns out comprehension, that flare rises again, invisible but real. The mediums change, telegrams become broadcasts. Broadcasts become data, yet the risk stays the same, the speed of light outrunning the speed of understanding. What the river teaches in its endless motion is patience that truth cannot be forced, only revealed in reflection. Some nights, local fishermen still claim they see a faint shimmer on the current. Scientists call it phosphorus. Poets call it memory. Either way, it reminds us that history does not end when records close. It lingers glowing at the edge of vision, asking to be read correctly this time. The flare of Fort Pillow has traveled far through wars, through books, through screens, and it still burns not as fire but as lesson. Maybe that's what the river wanted all along, not revenge, not silence, but remembrance. A reminder that misunderstanding is the oldest weapon we own, and listening, the only defense we ever had. The river keeps its rhythm, the world keeps sending signals, and somewhere between them, the light waits, still rising, still asking to be understood. You've just listened to another untold file from Classified History. If you want to uncover more stories, History Tried to Forget, subscribe and stay with us.